Tom. The silence that filled the Harrington mansion that December evening was the kind that cuts through your soul like Chicago's bitter winter wind. It was the silence that follows a public humiliation so deep, so crushing, that even the grandfather clock in the marble foyer seemed to pause its endless ticking. In the grand ballroom, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on imported Italian marble, the echo of harsh words still hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. I don't know where you're listening from right now. Maybe you're washing dishes in a quiet kitchen, folding clothes while the house sleeps, or sitting on a bus after another long day of work that nobody really sees. Whatever you're doing, wherever life has placed you at this moment, I promise you that today's story will touch something deep inside your heart. It's about the invisible battles we fight every single day, about the quiet strength that lives in the hands of those who serve, and about a truth so powerful it can melt the coldest heart and rebuild what seemed forever broken. Edward Harrington stood 6 feet tall in his perfectly tailored navy suit, his silver hair combed back with precision that matched the sharp lines of his jaw. At 58, he commanded respect in Chicago's most exclusive boardrooms, his real estate empire spanning from the glittering towers of the Loop to the sprawling suburbs that stretched toward the lake. His penthouse office on the 40th floor of the Willis Tower offered a view that most people could only dream of. The entire city spread beneath him like a kingdom he had conquered with ambition, ruthless business acumen, and investments that had multiplied his inherited wealth into a fortune worth hundreds of millions. His stock portfolio included blue-chip companies, cryptocurrency investments that had soared beyond imagination, and commercial properties that generated income while he slept. Money flowed through his accounts like water through the Chicago River, steady, predictable, and seemingly endless. But all that wealth, all those zeros in his bank statements, all the luxury that surrounded him in his Hyde Park mansion couldn't fill the void that had been eating at his soul for the past 2 years. Not since Margaret had died. Margaret, with her gentle laugh and warm brown eyes, who had been the only person who could make him smile without calculation, who could touch his hand and make him remember what it felt like to be human. The cancer had taken her slowly, deliberately, as if it wanted him to watch every precious moment slip away. And when it was over, when the funeral flowers had wilted and the sympathy cards had been filed away, Edward found himself alone in a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. The mansion itself was a testament to his success. 8 bedrooms, 10 bathrooms, a library with first-edition books he never read, a wine cellar stocked with bottles worth more than most people's annual salaries, and a kitchen equipped with professional-grade appliances that rarely felt the warmth of home cooking. The walls were decorated with original paintings by artists whose names appeared in auction catalogs, and Persian rugs that had been hand-woven by artisans whose families had perfected their craft for generations covered floors of imported Brazilian hardwood. Every surface gleamed with the kind of perfection that money could buy, but none of it could bring back the sound of Margaret's voice calling his name from the garden where she used to tend her roses. 3 buses. That's what it took for Maria Concepcion Gomez to travel from her small apartment in Pilsen to the tree-lined streets of Hyde Park every morning. 3 buses through Chicago's maze of neighborhoods, from the vibrant sounds of Mexican bakeries and the smell of fresh tortillas to the hushed elegance of mansions hidden behind iron gates and ancient oak trees. Maria would wake at 4:30 in the morning, her alarm clock a gentle buzz that never failed to stir her from dreams of her mother's kitchen back in Guadalajara, where sunlight streamed through lace curtains and the sound of her grandmother's molcajete grinding spices for mole created a rhythm that spoke of love and tradition. At 46, Maria carried herself with the quiet dignity that comes from years of honest work and honest pain. Her hands, small and strong, bore the tiny scars and calluses that told stories of countless jobs, cleaning offices until dawn, caring for elderly strangers who sometimes forgot her name but never forgot the gentleness of her touch, scrubbing floors in restaurants where the owners counted every penny while she counted every hour until she could return home. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a neat bun, secured with bobby pins that had seen better days, and her clothes were simple but spotless, a reflection of the pride she took in presenting herself with respect, even when the world seemed determined to overlook her completely. The apartment she shared with her younger brother Carlos was small, but filled with warmth that no amount of money could purchase. The walls were covered with family photographs, her mother in her wedding dress, her father holding a guitar under a Mexican moon, her grandparents standing proudly in front of their small house with its painted blue door and climbing bougainvillea. The kitchen table was scarred from years of use, but it was where Carlos spread his textbooks every evening, studying engineering with the focused determination of someone who understood that education was a ladder out of poverty. Maria worked multiple jobs to pay his tuition, to keep their small refrigerator filled with food, to send money back to their aging mother, who still lived in the house where Maria had learned to make tamales and fold laundry and pray for better days that sometimes seemed as distant as the stars. When Margaret Harrington passed away, the mansion staff had dwindled to almost nothing. The head housekeeper had resigned, claiming the atmosphere had become too depressing. The gardener continued to maintain the grounds, but even the roses seemed to droop with neglect. Edward had tried to manage with a rotating series of cleaning services, but none of them understood the particular requirements of maintaining a house where every object had a story, and every room held memories that needed to be honored rather than merely dusted. It was Mrs. Patricia Chen, the neighbor who lived in the equally impressive mansion next door, who recommended Maria. Mrs. Chen had employed Maria for special occasions, dinner parties where politicians and business leaders gathered to discuss deals worth millions, while Maria silently refilled water glasses and cleared plates, invisible in her efficiency. "She's not like the others, Edward," Mrs. Chen had told him over coffee in his conservatory, where winter light struggled through glass walls that needed cleaning. "She understands how to work in a house like this. She has respect for beautiful things, and she works without making noise or drama. You need someone who won't try to change everything and won't gossip about your private affairs." Edward had nodded, though he barely listened. He needed someone competent and invisible, someone who could maintain the illusion that life was continuing normally, even as everything inside him felt frozen in perpetual winter. He didn't want sympathy or conversation or reminders that he was still alive when the most important part of him had died with Margaret. He just wanted the house to function, to stay clean and organized, so he could continue going through the motions of his daily routine without having to think about domestic details. On a gray February morning, when the wind off Lake Michigan carried the promise of more snow, Maria stood at the servants' entrance of the Harrington mansion for the first time. She wore her best coat, a navy wool blend that she had bought second-hand but had carefully altered to fit properly, and carried a small leather purse that had been her mother's, containing her identification, emergency bus fare, and a small silver cross that had been blessed by the priest at St. Procopius Church in Pilsen. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold air as she rang the bell, her heart beating with the familiar mixture of hope and apprehension that came with starting any new job. The kitchen where she would spend most of her time was magnificent by any standard: granite countertops, professional-grade stainless steel appliances, a central island larger than Maria's entire living room. Everything was spotless, but somehow cold, as if the room was waiting for someone to bring it back to life. The breakfast nook overlooked the garden where snow covered the dormant rose bushes, and Maria could imagine how beautiful it must have been when someone cared enough to tend the flowers and share the view with another person. Edward's first impression of Maria was that she was exactly what he had ordered: quiet, efficient, and unlikely to disturb his carefully constructed solitude. She was neither young enough to remind him of possibilities he had lost, nor old enough to remind him of mortality he preferred to ignore. She spoke English with a soft accent that made her words sound like a prayer, and she moved through the house with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to clean around sleeping children and navigate narrow hallways without making the floorboards creak. Their first conversation was brief and purely professional. Edward explained his schedule, his preferences for how rooms should be maintained, his requirement that she work around his home office hours when he conducted business calls with investors in Tokyo and London. Deals involving millions of dollars in commercial real estate and cryptocurrency portfolios that fluctuated with global markets. Maria nodded and took mental notes, asking only practical questions about cleaning supplies and laundry instructions. She didn't comment on the family photographs that lined the hallway or the obvious absence of any recent pictures. She didn't ask about the master bedroom that clearly hadn't been occupied in months, or the woman's clothing that still hung in the walk-in closet, protected by garment bags but never worn. What Maria saw, but Edward couldn't, was a house that was dying from loneliness. She recognized the signs because she had felt them in her own heart during the long months when her mother had been sick, and Maria had worked extra shifts to pay for medical bills. Coming home too exhausted to cook a proper meal or call friends or remember what it felt like to laugh. She saw it in the way dust gathered on surfaces despite regular cleaning, as if sadness itself left a residue that no amount of polishing could completely remove. She saw it in the fresh flowers that Edward ordered weekly but never seemed to notice, expensive arrangements that wilted unobserved in crystal vases. In the days that followed, Maria established her routine with the methodical precision of someone who understood that good work required good habits. She arrived each morning at 7:30, letting herself in through the kitchen entrance with the key Edward had given her, and began by starting coffee in the machine that probably cost more than she earned in a month. The sound of grinding beans and brewing coffee would join the soft classical music that played continuously throughout the house, creating an atmosphere that felt like a high-end hotel rather than a family home. While Edward remained secluded in his office, managing his real estate empire and monitoring stock market fluctuations that could add or subtract millions from his net worth in a single day, Maria moved through the mansion like a gentle spirit, dusting antiques that belonged in museums, vacuuming oriental rugs that had been woven by master craftsmen, and polishing silver that reflected light but seemed to absorb no warmth. She cleaned each room as if it were sacred space, understanding that these objects had once been part of a love story, chosen by two people who had planned to grow old together, surrounded by beautiful things. The first crack in Edward's indifference came on a Thursday morning in March, when he walked into the kitchen earlier than usual, and found Maria humming while she prepared fresh fruit for his breakfast. The melody was haunting and sweet, something that sounded like a lullaby or a hymn, and for a moment Edward felt something stir in his chest that he had thought was permanently frozen. He stood in the doorway, unnoticed, watching as Maria arranged strawberries and melon in a pattern that turned a simple meal into something approaching art. Her movements were economical but graceful, and there was something in her concentration, in the care she took with a task that no one would witness or praise, that reminded him of Margaret arranging flowers from her garden. When Maria looked up and saw him watching, she didn't startle or apologize for making noise. She simply smiled, not the servile expression he expected from household staff, but a genuine moment of human warmth, and asked if he would prefer his coffee in the dining room or if he would like to eat in the breakfast nook where the morning light was particularly beautiful. The question surprised him because no one had asked his preference about anything personal in months. His business associates asked about profit margins and development timelines. His accountant asked about tax strategies and charitable deductions that could offset his substantial income. But no one asked whether he might enjoy watching the sunrise while eating breakfast. Almost without realizing it, Edward found himself accepting Marie's suggestion and sitting at the small table in the breakfast nook. The food she had prepared was simple but perfect, presented with the kind of attention to detail that transformed necessity into pleasure. As he ate, he became aware of sounds he had forgotten existed: birds singing in the garden, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic that proved life was continuing in the world beyond his gates. For the first time in months, Breakfast felt like more than just fuel for another day of emptiness. That afternoon, Edward found himself thinking about the melody Maria had been humming. He couldn't get it out of his head, and when she arrived the next morning, he found himself lingering in the kitchen longer than necessary, hoping to hear it again. When he finally worked up the courage to ask about it, Maria's face lit up with a memory that seemed to erase years from her features. It was a song her grandmother used to sing while making tortillas, she explained. A song about making something beautiful from simple ingredients, about how love could transform ordinary moments into treasures that would live forever in memory. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it was the longest personal exchange Edward had had with another human being since Margaret's funeral. When Maria asked quietly if he had enjoyed music with his wife, Edward felt his throat constrict with emotions he had spent 2 years trying to suppress. Instead of answering directly, he simply nodded and walked away, but something had shifted between them. Maria had seen past his wealth and his grief to the man who was still alive underneath all that protective ice, and Edward had glimpsed the possibility that his house might someday feel like a home again. As winter melted into spring, small changes began to accumulate in the Harrington mansion. Maria started opening windows to let fresh air circulate through rooms that had been closed and stagnant for too long. She began placing wildflowers from the garden in simple glasses rather than letting them bloom unseen, bringing touches of life and color to spaces that had forgotten how to welcome visitors. She cooked meals with ingredients that filled the kitchen with aromas that seemed to awaken the house itself. Bread baking on Sunday mornings, soups that simmered slowly throughout the afternoon, casseroles that reminded Edward of childhood dinners he had thought were lost forever. The routine between them developed naturally, without negotiation or formal agreement. Edward would emerge from his office at regular intervals to find Maria working quietly in whatever room needed attention, and gradually he began to pause for brief conversations that revealed pieces of their respective stories. Maria spoke about her brother's progress in engineering school, about the pride that filled her heart when she watched him solve complex mathematical problems that would help him build bridges and skyscrapers that would stand for generations. She talked about her mother's letters, filled with news from Guadalajara and recipes for traditional dishes that connected across borders and generations. Edward, slowly and carefully, began to share fragments of his own history. He talked about building his business from a small construction company his father had started, about learning to read financial statements and negotiate deals that would transform empty lots into shopping centers and office buildings. He spoke about Margaret's passion for gardening, about how she could make anything grow and bloom, about the way she had insisted that their house should be filled with life and laughter rather than just expensive objects that impressed visitors, but brought no joy to daily living. The breakthrough came on an April afternoon when Edward returned from a particularly difficult business meeting to find Maria sitting at the kitchen table, her shoulders shaking with silent tears. Nearby, her cell phone displayed a photo of an elderly woman in a hospital bed, surrounded by flowers and family members who were trying to smile for the camera. Maria's mother had suffered a stroke, and the doctors in Guadalajara were not optimistic about her recovery. The woman who had taught Maria to cook and clean and pray and love was dying 3,000 miles away, and Maria could not afford to take time off work to be with her during what might be their final weeks together. For the first time since hiring her, Edward truly saw Maria not as an employee, but as a fellow human being carrying her own burden of loss and love and impossible choices. He saw how she had been using her salary to send money home, how she had been working extra hours not for personal gain, but to ensure her mother could afford the medications that might buy a few more precious months. He saw how she had been carrying this worry alone, never mentioning her personal struggles, because she understood that her job was to make his life easier, not to burden him with her own pain. Without thinking about business protocols or professional boundaries, Edward sat down across from Maria at the kitchen table and asked what he could do to help. The question seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised him, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other across the scarred wooden surface that had become the heart of their daily interactions. When Maria finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he had to lean forward to hear her words. She didn't want charity, she explained, but if there was any way she could arrange her schedule to visit her mother, even for a few days, she would be grateful beyond words. Edward's response was immediate and definitive. He would pay for her plane ticket to Mexico, cover all her expenses during her stay, and hold her job until she was ready to return. More than that, he would personally ensure that her mother received the best possible medical care, calling specialists in Mexico City who could provide treatments that might not be available in smaller hospitals. When Maria tried to protest that she could never repay such generosity, Edward waved away her concerns with a gesture that seemed to sweep away 2 years of emotional isolation, along with her worries about money. The week that Maria spent with her dying mother was transformative for both of them, though in different ways. Maria was able to sit beside her mother's bed, holding the hands that had taught her to knead masa and braid hair and fold sheets with hospital corners. She was able to listen to stories about her grandparents and great-grandparents, family history that would have been lost forever if she had not been there to receive these final gifts of memory and love. She was able to sing the old songs and prepare her mother's favorite foods, and simply be present during the sacred transition from life to whatever comes after. Meanwhile, Edward discovered what his house felt like without Maria's daily presence, and the silence that returned was more profound than the loneliness he had felt after Margaret's death. The coffee machine sat unused because he had forgotten how to operate it. Dust began to accumulate on surfaces that had been spotless for months. The flowers Marie had placed around the house wilted and dropped petals that no one swept away. Most significantly, Edward realized that he had been looking forward to their brief daily conversations, that Maria's gentle presence had become an anchor point in his drifting existence. When Maria returned from Mexico, something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. She had seen Edward's capacity for kindness and generosity, his willingness to extend himself for another person's welfare, even when there was nothing in it for him. Edward had experienced his own capacity for caring about another person's happiness, and he had discovered that helping Maria had brought him more satisfaction than any business success in recent memory. They had moved beyond employer and employee to something approaching friendship, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of what it meant to love someone you might lose. The summer passed peacefully, with Maria tending to both the house and, increasingly, to Edward's gradual emotional recovery. She encouraged him to eat meals in the breakfast nook rather than at his desk, to notice the way morning light moved across the garden, to appreciate the changing colors of leaves as autumn approached. She began cooking dishes that reminded him of childhood, comfort foods that required time and attention, but created memories along with nourishment. She convinced him to donate some of Margaret's clothing to women's shelters, not to erase her memory, but to ensure that beautiful things continued to bring joy rather than gathering dust in a closet that no one opened. Edward, in turn, became genuinely interested in Maria's life beyond his house. He asked about Carlos's progress in school and celebrated when his scholarship was renewed for another year. He inquired about Maria's health and insisted that she take breaks when she worked too hard. He began to understand that her quiet efficiency masked a complex inner life filled with dreams and worries and hopes that deserved to be acknowledged and respected. Most importantly, he began to see that Maria's gentle strength was not weakness, but a form of power that could transform sadness into acceptance and isolation into connection. By October, the Harrington mansion felt alive again, in ways that had nothing to do with money or expensive renovations. Rooms that had been closed and unused were aired and cleaned and gradually returned to daily life. The kitchen became a gathering place where Edward would sit with his morning coffee while Maria prepared fresh bread or planned meals that would nourish both body and spirit. The garden, which had been maintained but not truly tended, began to flourish under Maria's attention as she planted bulbs that would bloom in spring and herbs that would flavor winter soups. The transformation was subtle but profound, like watching a photograph slowly develop in a darkroom, revealing images that had always been there but needed time and gentle chemistry to become visible. Edward began to smile more readily, to speak with warmth rather than just efficiency, to remember that he was capable of humor and spontaneous kindness. Maria, no longer walking on eggshells around Edward's grief, began to hum while she worked, to share stories about her family and neighborhood, to laugh when Edward attempted to pronounce Spanish words or asked questions about Mexican traditions he wanted to understand. Their friendship deepened through October and November, built on daily interactions that had become important to both of them. Edward found himself scheduling his business calls around their informal coffee breaks, and Maria began to arrive a few minutes early each morning, not because her job required it, but because she enjoyed the peaceful moments when the house was just beginning to wake up, and there was time for genuine conversation before the day's responsibilities took over. The crisis that would test everything they had built together arrived with Chicago's first serious snowstorm in December, just as the city was preparing for Christmas. Sophie Harrington, Edward's 19-year-old daughter, had been away at Northwestern University, studying journalism and sociology, learning about income inequality and social justice issues that her privileged upbringing had shielded her from experiencing directly. Sophie was brilliant, passionate, and increasingly uncomfortable with the wealth she had inherited through no effort of her own. She had spent the semester volunteering at homeless shelters and food banks, writing articles for the university newspaper about minimum wage workers and immigration policy, developing a social conscience that put her frequently at odds with her father's more conservative worldview. When Sophie came home for Christmas break, she immediately noticed the changes in her father and in the atmosphere of their house. Edward seemed less brittle, less angry, more connected to life around him. The mansion felt warmer, more welcoming, filled with sounds and smells that reminded her of childhood holidays when her mother had been alive to create Christmas magic. She was curious about these changes and grateful for them, but she was also keenly aware of the social dynamics that made them possible. Sophie had inherited her father's sharp intelligence and her mother's empathy, but she had also developed the idealistic fervor of someone young enough to believe that unfair systems could be changed through righteous anger and determined action. When she learned that Maria was responsible for the positive changes in her father's emotional state and their home's atmosphere, Sophie wanted to know everything about Maria's life, her family, her struggles, her dreams. Unlike her father, who had only gradually learned to see Maria as a complete human being, Sophie immediately recognized that Maria was someone worthy of respect and genuine friendship. The college student and the middle-aged housekeeper began to develop their own relationship, crossing boundaries of class and culture with the energy and optimism that youth brings to new discoveries. Sophie was fascinated by Maria's stories about Pilsen, about the Mexican-American community that maintained traditions while building new dreams, about the challenges of working multiple jobs while supporting family members who depended on remittances sent home. Maria, in turn, was charmed by Sophie's enthusiasm and intelligence, by her genuine interest in learning Spanish phrases and traditional recipes, by her questions about social issues that affected immigrant communities. What Sophie also brought home from college was a heightened awareness of social inequality and a deep discomfort with the way wealth could insulate people from understanding how the majority of the world actually lived. She had taken courses in economics and sociology that had opened her eyes to the vast disparities between her family's lifestyle and the experiences of people who worked in service industries. She understood that her father's real estate empire, his stock portfolio worth tens of millions, his cryptocurrency investments, and his property holdings generated more income in a single month than Maria would earn in years of daily labor. The tension that had been building since Sophie's return home reached a breaking point during the Christmas party that Edward hosted annually for his business associates, political allies, and social peers. It was the kind of gathering that epitomized Chicago's elite social scene, women in designer gowns that cost more than most families spend on housing, men discussing investment strategies and development projects worth hundreds of millions, caterers serving food that had been flown in from specialty vendors around the world. The guest list included real estate moguls, city council members, federal judges, and successful entrepreneurs whose combined wealth could have funded entire school districts or hospital systems. Edward had planned this party partly as a declaration that he was ready to re-engage with social obligations he had avoided during his period of deepest grief. He wanted to demonstrate that the Harrington name still carried weight in Chicago's power circles, that his business acumen remained sharp, and that his mansion could still serve as a showcase for the kind of entertaining that cemented profitable relationships and political influence. The evening was meant to be a celebration of his return to social prominence, a statement that he had recovered from personal tragedy and was ready to expand his empire even further. Maria had worked for days to prepare the mansion for this event, polishing silver that hadn't been used in 2 years, arranging flowers throughout the house, preparing special linens and dishes that would create the perfect atmosphere for Edward's professional networking. She moved through the party as she always worked, efficiently and invisibly, ensuring that guests' glasses remained filled, that empty plates were removed instantly, that every detail contributed to the seamless luxury that Edward's reputation required. She wore her best black dress and sensible shoes that would allow her to work for hours without discomfort, blending into the background while enabling the foreground to shine. The guests barely noticed Maria's presence, except to hand her empty champagne flutes or request directions to the powder room. To them, she was part of the mansion's infrastructure, as invisible and essential as the heating system or the sound system that provided background music for their conversations about tax shelters and zoning variances. When they discussed their own domestic staff, it was usually to complain about turnover rates or to recommend agencies that could provide reliable workers who understood their place and didn't cause drama or demand elaborate benefits packages. The moment that would shatter the evening's facade of polite sophistication began when Maria was serving dessert in the main dining room, carefully placing crystal bowls filled with imported Belgian chocolates and fresh berries at each guest's place. One of Edward's business partners, fortified by several glasses of wine and his own sense of superior social position, made a comment about the silver serving spoon that Maria was using, suggesting loudly enough for surrounding guests to hear that Edward should keep a closer eye on his help, that valuable items had a way of disappearing when certain types of people had too much access to them. The comment was clearly directed at Maria, though the speaker avoided looking at her directly, preferring to address his concerns to Edward as if Maria were not present or capable of understanding English. The implication was unmistakable. Maria was not to be trusted with valuable objects. Her presence in the house represented a security risk, and Edward's judgment in hiring her was questionable. Other guests began to murmur agreement, sharing their own experiences with supposedly unreliable domestic workers and their strategies for preventing theft and ensuring proper subservience. Edward, caught off guard and influenced by alcohol and the social pressure of his peer group, responded in the worst possible way. Instead of defending Maria or redirecting the conversation, he chose to demonstrate his authority and social status by publicly humiliating the woman who had spent months helping him heal from grief and rediscover his capacity for human connection. In a voice loud enough for everyone in the dining room to hear, Edward told Maria to be more careful with the family silver, that she should remember she was working in a house where every object was worth more than she could afford to replace, that he wouldn't tolerate any items going missing. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, poisoning the atmosphere and revealing ugly truths that elegant surroundings and expensive clothing could not disguise. Maria's face flushed with shame and hurt, but she maintained her dignity, setting down the serving spoon with steady hands and stepping back from the table without defending herself or arguing. The guests watched this performance of dominance and submission, with the satisfied attention of an audience witnessing a play that confirmed their assumptions about social hierarchy and proper behavior. But Sophie Harrington had also been watching, and what she saw filled her with a rage that burned hotter than embarrassment or social discomfort. This was her father, the man she had thought was learning to be more human, more compassionate, more aware of other people's worth, publicly degrading someone who had shown their family nothing but loyalty and kindness. This was Maria, the woman who had helped her father smile again, who had filled their house with warmth and life, who had shared stories about her family and dreams with the same generosity she brought to everything else, being treated like a potential criminal in front of strangers who would never know enough about her character to make such judgments. Sophie's voice, when she spoke, cut through the dining room's satisfied murmur like a sword through silk. "Dad, stop." The words were quiet, but so filled with authority and disappointment that every conversation ceased immediately. Edward looked at his daughter with surprise and growing alarm as Sophie stood up from her chair, her face pale with anger, but her voice completely controlled. What came next was not a teenage outburst, but a moral reckoning delivered with the precision of someone who had learned to research facts and present arguments that could not be dismissed. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Sophie said, her gaze moving from her father to the guests who had participated in Maria's humiliation. "You sit here in your expensive clothes, drinking wine that costs more than most people make in a week, and you talk about Maria like she's somehow less trustworthy than you are." She paused, letting the accusation settle in the room's uncomfortable silence. "But Maria is the most honest person in this house. She's the one who makes sure you have clean clothes and fresh food and a functioning household while you're upstairs counting your money and calculating your stock options." The guests shifted uncomfortably, unused to being challenged by someone young enough to be their daughter, but Sophie was just getting started. She had spent months learning about economic inequality, about the way wealthy people justified paying poverty wages while expecting absolute loyalty and gratitude. She had written research papers about domestic workers who sent most of their earnings home to support extended families, about the impossible choices faced by people who cleaned rich people's houses while their own children attended underfunded schools and lived in neighborhoods where safety and opportunity were luxuries they couldn't afford. "Do you want to know what Maria does with the money you pay her?" Sophie asked, her voice rising with emotion but remaining articulate and precise. "She supports her brother through engineering school, she sends money to her sick mother in Mexico, and she still manages to show up here every morning with a smile and a willingness to make your life easier. She's never taken so much as a sugar cube from this house without permission, but she's given you something more valuable than your precious silver. She's given you back your humanity." The words found their target with devastating accuracy. Edward felt the blood drain from his face as he realized what he had done, how completely he had betrayed the trust and friendship that Maria had offered him during his darkest months. The guests around the table, earlier so confident in their social superiority, now looked uncomfortable and vaguely ashamed, as if Sophie had forced them to see their behavior through the eyes of their own children. The young woman, standing before them with her father's intelligence and her mother's moral courage, had exposed the ugly reality beneath their polite facades. Sophie wasn't finished. Years of watching her father build his wealth through real estate deals that sometimes displaced lower-income families, years of living in luxury while attending schools with classmates who worked part-time jobs to help their families pay rent, years of gradually understanding how much suffering could hide behind beautiful surfaces, all of this erupted in a speech that was both personal attack and social critique. "You talk about valuable things," Sophie continued, "but you can't see that Maria is worth more than everything in this room combined. She's raising her brother, she's caring for her mother, she's working multiple jobs, and she still finds time to worry about whether you're eating properly and getting enough sleep. When was the last time anyone here made that kind of sacrifice for someone else? When was the last time you showed that kind of loyalty to anyone who couldn't do something for you in return? The silence that followed was profound and terrible, filled with recognition and shame that no amount of money could purchase or eliminate. Edward understood that his daughter had just articulated truths about his character and his values that he had been avoiding for his entire adult life. The guests understood that they had been judged by someone young enough to still believe in justice and found wanting in ways that had nothing to do with their bank accounts or social connections. Maria, standing near the doorway where she had retreated during Sophie's speech, felt tears running down her cheeks, not tears of humiliation anymore, but tears of gratitude for this fierce young woman who had chosen to defend her when she could not defend herself. In all her years of working for wealthy families, no one had ever spoken up for her dignity or acknowledged the value of her contributions or recognized that she deserved to be treated with basic human respect. But the damage had been done, and everyone in the room knew it. Edward had revealed something about himself that could not be taken back or explained away. He had shown that despite months of apparent growth and healing, he was still capable of sacrificing someone else's dignity to maintain his own social position. The friendship that had developed between him and Maria, built through daily kindnesses and genuine conversations, had been shattered by a few sentences spoken to impress people whose approval would never be worth the cost. The party ended early, guests departing with the awkward haste of people who had witnessed something private and shameful. Edward was left alone in his dining room, surrounded by the remnants of an evening that was supposed to demonstrate his recovery, but had instead revealed the depth of his moral bankruptcy. Maria had disappeared, presumably to finish cleaning up, or perhaps simply to escape to somewhere she could process what had happened without having to maintain professional composure. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the Harrington mansion became strained and artificial. Maria continued to fulfill her job responsibilities with the same efficiency as always, but the warmth and genuine connection that had developed between her and Edward seemed to have evaporated completely. Their conversations became strictly professional, questions about schedules and preferences, updates about household maintenance, nothing personal or meaningful. The comfortable rhythm they had established over months of gradually deepening friendship was replaced by the kind of careful distance that reminded Edward daily of what he had lost through his own weakness and cowardice. Edward wanted to apologize, but he couldn't find words adequate to address what he had done. He had not simply made a mistake or spoken carelessly. He had deliberately chosen to humiliate someone who trusted him, someone who had helped him heal, someone who deserved better from him. Every morning when Maria arrived for work, every evening when she quietly finished her tasks and said goodnight, Edward felt the weight of his betrayal and his cowardice. He understood that he had revealed something about his character that might be unforgivable, that his actions had proven Sophie's accusations about his values and priorities. Maria, for her part, felt the particular kind of pain that comes from having your trust betrayed by someone you had begun to care about. She had allowed herself to believe that Edward saw her as something more than hired help, that their conversations and shared moments had meant something to him beyond temporary convenience. She had opened her heart to his grief and his gradual healing, had taken pride in helping him rediscover joy and human connection. Learning that he was willing to throw all of that away to maintain his social status felt like a wound that might never fully heal. The breaking point came in February, almost exactly 1 year after Maria had started working for the Harrington family. The winter had been particularly harsh, and Maria had been arriving earlier each morning to ensure the house was warm and welcoming when Edward began his day. She had also been staying later in the evenings, preparing meals that could be reheated easily, and ensuring that Edward's household ran smoothly, despite the emotional cold that had settled between them. The crisis began with a simple misunderstanding that escalated because of the underlying tension neither of them knew how to address directly. Edward had been expecting an important business call from investors in London, a conversation about a commercial development project worth $50 million that could significantly expand his real estate portfolio. When the call didn't come through at the scheduled time, he began to worry that he had missed it, that some technical problem or scheduling confusion might cost him an opportunity that had taken months to develop. In his anxiety and frustration, Edward began looking for someone to blame for the disruption to his routine. When he discovered that the phone in his home office had been unplugged for cleaning, he immediately assumed that Maria had interfered with his business affairs through carelessness or ignorance. Without investigating further or asking for her explanation, he confronted Maria in the kitchen where she was preparing his lunch, accusing her of jeopardizing important business deals through her failure to understand the difference between essential equipment and ordinary household items. The accusation was unfair and hurtful, but it was also the final straw in a relationship that had been strained beyond its breaking point. Maria looked at Edward with eyes that held no anger, only sadness and a kind of resigned understanding that this was who he really was beneath the temporary kindness he had shown during his recovery. She removed her apron, gathered her personal belongings, and informed Edward quietly that she would not be returning to work the following day. Edward's immediate reaction was relief mixed with something that might have been panic. He was relieved to end the daily reminder of his moral failure, but he was also terrified of returning to the empty silence that had consumed his house before Maria's arrival. He told himself that he could easily find another housekeeper, someone more professional and less emotionally complicated, someone who would work efficiently without expecting personal consideration or friendship. But even as he tried to convince himself that Maria's departure was actually a positive development, he knew that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Maria's exit from the Harrington mansion was as quiet and dignified as everything else she had done during her employment there. She left no angry words, no demands for additional compensation, no threats to spread gossip about Edward's private affairs. She simply gathered her few personal possessions, returned the key to the servant's entrance, and walked away from a job that had become much more than employment. It had been a lifeline for both of them, a connection that had enabled healing and growth and the possibility of genuine human friendship across the barriers of class and culture. The house immediately began to die again. The silence returned, heavier and more oppressive than before because now Edward knew what he was missing. Food appeared through catering services, but meals felt mechanical and unsatisfying. Cleaning crews maintained the mansion's surfaces, but rooms felt sterile and unwelcoming. The small touches that had made the house feel alive, fresh flowers, open windows, the smell of bread baking, disappeared completely, replaced by the artificial perfection of professional services that had no emotional investment in the results of their work. Edward tried to maintain his normal routine, but everything felt hollow and meaningless. His business remained profitable, his investments continued to generate substantial returns, but none of his financial success could fill the emptiness that Maria's absence had revealed. He found himself wondering whether she had found other employment, whether she was able to continue supporting her brother's education and her mother's medical expenses, whether she ever thought about the months they had spent gradually becoming friends before he destroyed everything through his weakness and pride. The revelation that would change everything came through Sophie, who had maintained her own relationship with Maria despite her father's behavior. Sophie had gotten Maria's phone number before returning to Northwestern, and she had continued to call regularly, treating Maria as a friend rather than someone who had once been employed by her family. It was through these conversations that Sophie learned about Maria's other work, about the complex and impressive life that Edward had never bothered to discover or understand. Maria Concepcion Gomez was not simply a domestic worker struggling to survive in Chicago's expensive economy. She was a woman who had built a network of employment and community connections that demonstrated remarkable intelligence, resilience, and leadership. In addition to her work for wealthy families in Hyde Park, Maria volunteered at St. Procopius Church, coordinating food drives and translation services for recently arrived immigrants who needed help navigating bureaucratic systems. She tutored children in her neighborhood, helping them with homework and college applications, drawing on her own hard-won knowledge of how education could open doors to better opportunities. Most significantly, Maria had been using her savings to start a small catering business, preparing traditional Mexican food for community celebrations, quinceañeras, and cultural festivals throughout Pilsen and Little Village. Her tamales and mole had developed a reputation that brought customers from across the city, and she was gradually building a client base that might eventually allow her to leave domestic work entirely. The money she earned from catering went directly to her brother's tuition and her mother's medical bills, but she was also saving to bring her mother to Chicago for better medical treatment and to help other young people in her community afford college expenses. When Sophie described Maria's full life to her father, Edward felt ashamed on a level that had nothing to do with social embarrassment or professional reputation. He realized that he had employed someone extraordinary, someone whose intelligence and compassion and business acumen rivaled his own, and he had treated her as if she were invisible and replaceable. Maria's ability to work multiple jobs while supporting family members and building community connections and starting her own business revealed a kind of strength and vision that Edward recognized from his own early career when he had been building his real estate empire through determination and strategic thinking. The deeper revelation was that Maria had been offering him something much greater than housekeeping services. She had been sharing her life with him, bringing the warmth of her family traditions and cultural heritage into his sterile mansion, teaching him through example how to find meaning in daily routine and human connection. Her presence had healed him, not because she was subservient or grateful for employment, but because she was a complete human being whose own wisdom and experience could enrich his narrow world. Edward spent weeks wrestling with this new understanding of who Maria really was and what he had lost through his own blindness and cruelty. His business continued to prosper. A new commercial development had been approved. His cryptocurrency investments had gained substantial value. His stock portfolio had reached record highs. But none of these successes felt meaningful anymore. The wealth that was supposed to provide security and satisfaction now felt like a barrier that separated him from authentic human relationships and moral clarity. The decision to find Maria and attempt to make amends was not easy or simple. Edward knew that he had forfeited any right to her forgiveness or friendship, that his apology would have to acknowledge not just his specific actions, but the entire worldview that had made those actions possible. He would have to admit that his assumptions about social hierarchy and personal worth were fundamentally wrong, that his treatment of Maria had revealed moral failures that went much deeper than a single evening's poor judgment. Finding Maria was not difficult. Sophie provided her contact information and current address, but approaching her required Edward to overcome pride and fear that had protected him from genuine vulnerability for most of his adult life. He had to acknowledge that he needed forgiveness more than Maria needed his apology, that his emotional recovery depended on making peace with someone he had wronged who owed him absolutely nothing. The March afternoon when Edward traveled to Pilsen to find Maria was gray and cold, with a wind off the lake that cut through even his expensive overcoat. The neighborhood was vibrant with life that contrasted sharply with the quiet elegance of Hyde Park. Children playing on sidewalks, music spilling from open doorways, the smells of cooking food and automotive repair shops and urban life lived without pretense or apology. The community center where Maria was volunteering was a converted warehouse, its brick walls covered with murals that celebrated Mexican-American culture and immigration stories that Edward had never bothered to understand. Inside the community center, Edward found Maria working with a group of elderly residents, helping them fill out tax forms and navigate Social Security paperwork, translating complex bureaucratic language into Spanish, and providing advocacy for people who might otherwise be overwhelmed by systems designed to exclude rather than assist. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in the same neat bun he remembered, her face animated with concentration and compassion as she patiently explained procedures that could mean the difference between financial stability and desperate poverty for the people she was helping. Watching Maria in her own community context, Edward finally understood the magnitude of his blindness and arrogance. This was not someone who needed his charity or protection. This was someone whose life had meaning and purpose that extended far beyond any single job or employer. Maria was a leader, an organizer, a bridge between cultures, someone whose intelligence and integrity commanded respect from everyone around her. The idea that he had ever considered her replaceable or insignificant now seemed not just wrong, but absurd. When Maria looked up and saw Edward standing in the doorway of the community center, her expression showed no anger or surprise, only a kind of calm recognition that suggested she had been expecting this moment. She excused herself from the tax preparation session and walked over to where Edward waited, her posture straight and dignified, her face showing the same composure that had carried her through months of working in his house and the betrayal that had ended their relationship. Edward's prepared apology fell apart in his mouth as he tried to find words adequate to address what he had done and what he now understood about Maria's worth and his own failures. Instead of the careful speech he had rehearsed, he found himself simply standing before her, his throat tight with emotions he had spent months trying to suppress. His eyes filling with tears that had nothing to do with business loss or social embarrassment, and everything to do with recognizing that he had destroyed something precious through his own moral cowardice. Maria's response was neither condemnation nor immediate forgiveness, but something more complex and healing. She acknowledged his apology with a quiet nod, neither accepting it completely nor rejecting it entirely, allowing space for the possibility that understanding and redemption might be possible but would require more than words. She explained that she was not angry with him anymore, that she had found peace through focusing on her own work and community responsibilities, but that she needed to see evidence of genuine change rather than just expressions of regret. The conversation that followed was unlike any Edward had ever had with another human being. Instead of trying to convince Maria to return to his employment or even to offer forgiveness, she challenged him to examine the beliefs and assumptions that had made his behavior possible. She asked him to consider what he had learned from their months of friendship and whether that learning had changed his understanding of other people who worked in service positions throughout his business empire and social world. Maria's challenge was not angry or accusatory, but genuinely curious about whether Edward was capable of growth that extended beyond his personal relationship with her. She wanted to know whether he would treat future employees with greater respect, whether he would use his wealth and influence to create opportunities for people like her brother who needed educational support, whether he would recognize that his financial success carried moral obligations to the community that had enabled his prosperity. The meeting ended without dramatic reconciliation or immediate restoration of their relationship, but with something more valuable, an understanding that forgiveness and redemption were possible, but would require sustained effort and genuine transformation rather than grand gestures or expensive gifts. Maria gave Edward her phone number, but made it clear that any renewed relationship between them would be based on equality and mutual respect rather than the employer-employee dynamic that had ultimately corrupted their original friendship. Over the following months, Edward began the difficult work of examining his beliefs and changing his behavior in ways that reflected genuine moral growth rather than social performance. He started by investigating Maria's catering business and becoming one of her first major corporate clients, hiring her to provide food for business meetings and social events where her traditional Mexican cuisine was genuinely appreciated rather than exoticized. He used his business connections to help her expand her client base and secure the permits and licenses needed to operate a legitimate restaurant. More significantly, Edward began to change how he treated all the service workers in his business and personal life. He learned the names of security guards and maintenance staff, asked about their families and personal goals, provided health insurance and educational benefits that went far beyond industry standards. He established a scholarship fund specifically for children of domestic workers and service employees, using his wealth to create opportunities for young people like Carlos to attend college without forcing their families into impossible financial situations. The transformation was gradual but profound, visible to anyone who knew Edward before and after his moral awakening. Colleagues and friends noticed that he spoke differently about employees and seemed genuinely interested in their welfare rather than just their productivity. His mansion, when he finally hired new household staff, became known as one of the best places to work in Chicago's domestic employment market, with fair wages, respectful treatment, and genuine appreciation for the people who maintained his comfortable lifestyle. The renewed friendship between Edward and Maria developed slowly and carefully, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine understanding rather than the unconscious power dynamics that had undermined their original relationship. Maria would occasionally accept invitations to have coffee with Edward when her schedule allowed, and these conversations became opportunities for both of them to share insights about life, family, culture, and the complex relationships between money and meaning in American society. Edward learned to appreciate Maria's stories about her community, her family traditions, her business challenges, and her dreams for the future. He gained understanding of immigration experiences, working-class struggles, and cultural richness that his privileged background had never exposed him to directly. Maria, in turn, came to see Edward as someone capable of genuine growth and moral courage when his ego and social conditioning were stripped away. The relationship that eventually emerged between them was deeper and more authentic than their original friendship, precisely because it had been tested by betrayal and rebuilt through conscious choice rather than circumstantial proximity. They had both learned that respect and affection could exist across dramatic differences in wealth and social position, but only when both parties were committed to seeing each other as complete human beings worthy of dignity and consideration. By the following Christmas, the Harrington mansion had been transformed, not just physically, but spiritually. Edward's holiday party that year was different in every possible way from the gathering that had precipitated the crisis with Maria. The guest list included people from Edward's business world, but also Maria's friends from Pilsen, Carlos and his engineering school classmates, community organizers and social workers, and small business owners whose presence created conversations that bridged cultural and economic divides. Maria provided the catering for the party, but she attended as an invited guest rather than hired help, wearing a beautiful dress that reflected her own sense of style and celebration rather than the uniform of domestic invisibility. The food she prepared honored her heritage while welcoming everyone to experience flavors and traditions that represented the immigrant contributions to Chicago's cultural richness. Sophie, home from Northwestern, where she was completing a major in journalism with a focus on social justice reporting, served as unofficial hostess for an event that celebrated diversity and inclusion rather than exclusivity and privilege. The conversations throughout the evening reflected genuine interest in learning about different experiences and perspectives rather than the social performance that had characterized Edward's previous entertaining. The transformation in the Harrington home represented something much larger than one wealthy man learning to treat his domestic employees with greater respect. It demonstrated the possibility that privilege could be used for moral good, that wealth could create bridges rather than barriers, and that authentic human relationships could transcend economic and cultural differences when both parties were committed to seeing each other clearly and honestly. Edward's business success continued and even accelerated as he discovered that treating employees well and investing in community development created long-term value that purely extractive practices could never achieve. His real estate developments began to include affordable housing components. His hiring practices prioritized local residents who could benefit from good jobs, and his investment strategies supported businesses that contributed to community welfare rather than just maximizing individual profit. Maria's catering business eventually expanded into a successful restaurant that became a destination for people throughout Chicago who appreciated authentic Mexican cuisine prepared with traditional techniques and contemporary presentation. The restaurant employed other immigrant women who had been working in domestic service, providing them with opportunities to develop culinary skills and build financial independence while honoring the cultural traditions that had sustained their families through generations of struggle. The story of Edward and Maria spread quietly through Chicago's social networks, becoming an example of how relationships based on genuine respect and mutual consideration could transform both individuals and communities. Their friendship demonstrated that healing was possible after betrayal, that growth was possible at any age, and that the most meaningful changes often happen through daily choices to see and honor the dignity in every person rather than through dramatic gestures or public displays of virtue. As seasons turned and their renewed friendship deepened, both Edward and Maria understood that they had discovered something rare and precious, a relationship that had survived the test of moral failure and emerged stronger and more authentic than before. They had learned that true friendship required seeing each other clearly, acknowledging mistakes honestly, and choosing to believe in each other's capacity for growth and goodness, even when evidence for that faith was sometimes difficult to find. But their story was far from over. As spring arrived once more in Chicago, bringing with it the promise of new growth and fresh beginnings, Edward found himself reflecting on how profoundly his understanding of success and meaning had changed. The numbers in his bank accounts continued to grow, his real estate empire expanded into new markets, and his investment portfolio reached heights that would have made his younger self dizzy with pride. Yet none of these achievements brought him the satisfaction he found in small moments. Sharing a laugh with Maria over coffee, watching Carlos graduate from engineering school with honors, seeing the joy on elderly immigrants' faces when Maria helped them navigate complex bureaucratic systems. The transformation had rippled outward in ways neither Edward nor Maria could have anticipated when they first met in that cold February kitchen more than 2 years earlier. Sophie had been inspired by their story to change her major from journalism to social work, determined to dedicate her career to addressing the systemic inequalities that created such vast distances between people living in the same city. She spent her summer internship working at the community center where Edward had found Maria, learning fluent Spanish and developing programs that helped immigrant families access educational and economic opportunities. Carlos, meanwhile, had graduated not just with his engineering degree, but with a job offer from Edward's company, not as a favor or act of charity, but because his innovative designs for sustainable construction techniques had impressed the engineering team during his internship. The young man who had once studied at a scarred kitchen table while his sister worked multiple jobs to pay his tuition was now designing buildings that would house Chicago families for generations, incorporating environmental consciousness with aesthetic beauty in ways that honored both his technical training and his cultural heritage. The ripple effects continued to expand throughout their interconnected communities. Other wealthy families in Hyde Park, witnessing the visible happiness and peace that had transformed Edward's household, began to examine their own relationships with domestic employees and service workers. Some changes were small, learning names, asking about families, providing better benefits, while others were more substantial, including collaborative efforts to establish cooperative housing for domestic workers and educational programs for their children. In Pilsen and the surrounding neighborhoods, Maria's success story became a source of inspiration and practical guidance for other immigrant women who dreamed of starting their own businesses. She began offering informal mentorship, sharing the business knowledge she had gained through trial and error, connecting women with resources for small business loans and marketing support. Her restaurant became a gathering place not just for customers seeking authentic food, but for entrepreneurs seeking authentic community and mutual support. The most profound change was perhaps the one that occurred within Edward himself, a transformation so complete that he sometimes wondered if his former self had been a different person entirely. The man who had once measured his worth in dollars and social status now found his deepest satisfaction in relationships and human connection. He woke each morning not to check stock prices or review profit margins, but to appreciate the sounds of life awakening in his neighborhood. Birds singing in the garden that Maria had taught him to truly see. Children walking to school past his gates, the distant hum of a city full of people pursuing their own dreams and struggles. His business meetings had evolved from purely transactional negotiations to conversations that considered the human impact of every decision. When evaluating potential real estate developments, Edward now insisted on community input sessions where longtime residents could voice their concerns and suggestions. His construction projects included not just luxury condominiums, but affordable housing units designed to strengthen rather than displace existing communities. His investment choices reflected values that his younger self would have dismissed as financially naive, but that his current self understood to be the foundation of sustainable prosperity. The annual Christmas party had become a beloved tradition that people throughout Chicago looked forward to, not for its display of wealth or exclusivity, but for its celebration of human connection across all boundaries of culture, class, and background. The guest list now included teachers and construction workers, students and grandmothers, small business owners and community activists, creating conversations that enriched everyone present with perspectives they might never otherwise encounter. Maria, moving through these gatherings as both hostess and honored guest, embodied the possibility that respect and dignity could be extended to every person regardless of their economic circumstances or immigration status. Her presence at these events was not token representation, but genuine leadership. Her voice sought out for insights about community needs and potential solutions. Her business acumen respected by entrepreneurs and investors who had learned to see past superficial markers of class and education to recognize intelligence and wisdom wherever they appeared. The restaurant that had grown from her small catering business had become a cultural landmark, featured in food magazines and travel guides as an authentic expression of Mexican culinary traditions adapted to Chicago's unique cultural landscape. But more important than its commercial success was its role as a community gathering place where families celebrated quinceañeras and graduations, where political organizers met to plan citizenship drives, where Spanish-language book clubs gathered to discuss literature that connected them to their heritage while navigating their American experience. The scholarship fund that Edward had established had grown beyond his initial contribution, attracting donations from other wealthy Chicagoans who had been inspired by the example of transformative philanthropy. Dozens of young people like Carlos now attended college with full financial support, their families freed from the impossible choice between education and economic survival. The fund prioritized not just academic achievement, but community service, seeking students who would use their education to strengthen the neighborhoods that had raised them. Sophie's social work career had flourished as she applied her privileged background and quality education to advocating for policies that addressed root causes of inequality rather than just its symptoms. Her investigative skills, honed through journalism training, helped her document how seemingly neutral bureaucratic procedures could systematically exclude immigrant families from services they desperately needed. Her bilingual abilities and cultural competency, developed through her friendship with Maria and her work in Pilsen, made her an effective bridge between service providers and the communities they were meant to serve. But perhaps the most meaningful measure of their transformation was visible in the small daily interactions that no newspaper would ever report and no award ceremony would ever recognize. Edward, greeting his security guard by name each morning and asking about his daughter's soccer season. Maria taking time during her busy restaurant shifts to help elderly customers practice their English while teaching younger customers phrases in Spanish. Sophie spending her free time tutoring immigrant children not because it looked good on her graduate school applications, but because she genuinely enjoyed watching their faces light up when difficult concepts finally made sense. As Edward and Maria continued their friendship through changing seasons and evolving circumstances, they both understood that they had participated in something larger than personal growth or individual redemption. They had demonstrated the possibility that American society's most intractable divisions between rich and poor, native-born and immigrant, employer and employee, could be bridged through sustained commitment to seeing each other's full humanity rather than just convenient social categories. Their story had become, without their intention or effort, a quiet testament to the possibility that privilege could be used for moral good rather than just personal advantage, that wealth could create bridges rather than barriers, that the American dream of opportunity and dignity could be extended to everyone willing to work for it. They had learned that true security came not from accumulating more resources than you could ever use, but from building relationships that could sustain you through any crisis, that genuine success was measured not in what you could buy, but in what you could contribute to the common good. The mansion where they had first met, originally a display of Edward's financial achievements and social status, had been transformed into something approaching its original purpose, a home where life was lived fully, where relationships were nurtured carefully, where the future was built through daily choices to treat everyone with the respect and consideration that dignity demands. The kitchen table where they had shared their first real conversation had become the heart of this transformation. A place where business plans were drawn up alongside family recipes, where political strategies were discussed over homemade bread, where children practiced their homework while adults planned community improvements. And, as another Christmas approached, bringing with it the promise of renewal and the opportunity for reflection, Edward and Maria found themselves contemplating not just how much their own lives had changed, but how much their example had inspired others to examine their own assumptions and choices. They had learned that meaningful change required not grand gestures or dramatic announcements, but sustained commitment to daily kindness, persistent effort to understand perspectives different from their own, and humble willingness to admit mistakes while working to do better. The silence that had once filled Edward's mansion, the crushing quiet of loneliness and grief, had been replaced by the gentle sounds of a life well lived, conversations filled with laughter and genuine interest, music that honored diverse traditions, the comfortable bustle of people who felt welcomed and valued. The silence that had once surrounded Maria, the invisibility of service work, the isolation of economic struggle, had been replaced by the recognition and respect that her intelligence, compassion, and leadership deserved. And you, have you ever worked for someone who learned from you without saying it out loud, someone who grew into a better person because of your patient example and quiet strength? Have you ever been in a position where your dignity made someone else recognize their own moral blindness? Have you ever experienced the particular kind of healing that comes from forgiveness, offered not because it was requested, but because it was the only path toward peace and restoration? Tell me your story in the comments below. If this tale touched something deep in your heart, please leave a like and subscribe so it can reach another woman who needs to be reminded of her own worth and strength. For more stories that celebrate the quiet heroes who hold families and communities together through their daily acts of love and service, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for traveling this emotional journey with us. Until our next story, remember that your dignity and compassion are forces capable of transforming the world, one relationship at a time.